Hello everybody! Today I'm going to show you how I turned this thrifted men's shirt into this dress. That's today on Refashioning with Rachel. First, while wearing the shirt, I placed a pin where I wanted my waistline to be. Then, using a seam ripper, I unpicked the pocket from the front of the shirt. I also unpicked the collar from the collar band. I drew a straight line across the shirt at the level where I placed the pin and cut along that line, saving the bottom portion for later. I cut off the sleeves and folded the shirt in half, carefully lining up the shoulder seams and side seams. Then I folded up a shirt that fit me well in the same way, and then I placed it on top of my thrifted shirt, carefully lining up the shoulder seams and the folds. And then I traced around the seams of the shirt, adding 1 centimeter for seam allowance. And after cutting along those lines, I had my bodice piece for the dress. Then, with right sides together, I sewed the side seams of the bodice. I used a serger to finish off my raw edges for this project, but a zigzag stitch would have worked just as well. I then sewed the collar band together, since it was left open after I removed the collar, by carefully making a stitch close to the folded edge. And I just used my fingers to remove some of those hanging threads and clean up the collar band. And then I ironed the side seams to make them lie flat. Moving on to the lower portion of the shirt, I cut off the bottom to straighten it out and saved that bottom piece for later. Then I cut out the button placket. And then, with right sides together, I sewed the front of this panel together, creating one big loop. I ironed that seam flat. And then made little notches to indicate the center front and the sides of this panel. And then sewed a basting stitch all around the edge. I then pulled on one of the basting stitch threads to gather up the top part of the skirt until it was about as wide as the bodice. I then pinned the skirt to the bodice with right sides together and lining up the center front and center back and side seams of the bodice with the notches that I made on the skirt earlier. I then sewed the skirt to the bodice, working with 1/4 section at a time and evening out the gathers as I sewed. And with the skirt attached, I pulled out the basting stitch. I wanted a ruffle for the bottom of the dress, so I cut out a bunch of 6-inch wide strips from the sleeves. And sewed them together end to end, creating one big loop. I ironed these seams in the ruffle to make it lie flat. And cut in some little notches to mark 4 equal sections of the ruffle. And sewed a basting stitch all along one edge. I cut in little notches on the bottom of the skirt in 4 equal sections so that I could match them later to the ruffle, and gathered up the basting stitch in the ruffle until it was about as wide as the bottom of the skirt. Then with right sides together, I pinned the ruffle to the bottom of the skirt, lining up the notches I made earlier. Then I sewed the ruffle to the dress, evening out the gathers as I sewed. I hemmed the bottom of the dress simply by folding over the raw edge twice and securing with a stitch. For the sleeves, I wanted to utilize the scraps of fabric that I cut off from the very bottom of the shirt. The scrap from the back of the shirt made a nice sleeve when folded in half, but the scraps from the front of the shirt came in 2 pieces, so I had to sew them together. So the wide end is going to be the shoulder seam of the sleeve. And then on the thinner end was where the underarm seam would be for the sleeve. I made sure to make the sleeves just a little bit bigger than the armholes. This shirt had somebody's name written on it. One thing I love about thrifted clothing is it already comes with a story. I copied the seams from the first sleeve onto the second sleeve so that they would match, and sewed the seams down. And I finished off the raw edges from these little underarm seams with a zigzag stitch. I ironed those seams flat. And pinned the sleeves to the armholes with right sides together, lining up the shoulder seams and the underarm seams to the side seams. And adding a few more pins. And since I made the sleeve just a little bit bigger than the armhole, I made a few tiny little pleats next to the shoulder seams to make the sleeve fit. And this will also create a nice little gathered sleeve effect at the shoulders. And then I sewed the sleeves to the armholes. At this point, the dress was basically finished, but I wanted to add a few more details. When I ripped out the pocket from the front of the shirt, I created a few holes. So I decided to cover them up with a bit of embroidery work. There were also a couple of tiny blemishes on the collar band, so I did a little bit of embroidery over those holes as well. And lastly, I made a tie from all the scraps. I cut out a bunch of 1.5-inch wide strips until I had enough strips to make a tie that would be twice as long as my waist. I sewed those strips together end to end. Ironed the seams flat and folded the whole strip in half lengthwise with right sides together and made a stitch about 5/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. I turned the loop right side out neatened it up with an iron, and tied knots on the ends. And then this project was finished. So here's a reminder of how it looked before. And here's how it looks now. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you did. And check out some of my other refashioning videos. And have a beautiful day.